Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Fred Boehmke. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Political Science and run the Iowa Social Science Research Center, where we often ask people what they think about politics and the political process and campaign finance as well. So I'm very honored to be moderating this panel, as I've used work and the products of everyone up here in front of you in my course on my research, my course on interest groups and lobbying. So it's really great. The people that we have here today are such great experts on this topic, and I'm sure they'll have a lot of great information for you. Okay, so Tracy did just provide a little bit of information about this, but please remember those note cards at the end of the aisle. If you have questions, please feel free to just fill them out as you think of them and hand them in, and we will collect them and have plenty of time for question and answer at the end of the panel. Okay, so I thought I would introduce the panelists each before they give their comments, so you can remember who they are and know how impressive they all are at the time. So we'll start today with Paul Herrnson, who will be giving the overview of our panel today. He's a professor of political science at the University of Connecticut. His research and teaching interests include political parties and elections, voting technology, ballot design, and election administration. So start out.
And my slides will pop up miraculously. All right, there we go. Well, good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here in this beautiful historic building on the University of Iowa campus. Thank you for that kind introduction. Tracy, thank you for setting this all up, and thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see such a huge crowd, including the people that are out in the halls, to attend this event. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Citizens United and the new politics of campaign finance. Oh, and that was the wrong button. And this slide is to remind me that I'm to give an overview, not go forever. I'll talk a little bit about what I refer to as the old new politics of campaign finance. Then I'll talk about Citizens United and SpeechNow.org, both cases against the Federal Election Commission. Then I'll talk about the new politics of campaign finance. So, the old new politics of campaign finance. It begins with Watergate. You may recall, a little over 4 decades ago, the committee to re-elect President Richard Nixon broke into Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate complex. We start there because the break-in was funded by large, undisclosed contributions from wealthy interests, and it gave rise to the Federal Election Campaign Act, our nation's first comprehensive campaign finance reform at the national level. What did the law do? Well, first, we learned that it made it so that money spent in federal elections had to originate as limited voluntary contributions from U.S. citizens. It placed disclosure on significant transactions greater than or equal to $200. It created an enforcement agency, the Federal Election Commission, one which now people are very critical of, and it created a public funding option for presidential candidates. And I guess I tried to get rid of this guy, the fat cat. It also helped establish and support some dynamics of fundraising. Candidates would initially get some support, a little bit of money. They would use that to build an organization and do some advertising. We all get to see that here in Iowa. I never see it in Connecticut. It's great to see TV ads. And if successful, that advertising would bring public support, more money, and there was a cycle. And the key point, fundraising is linked to public support. The demise of the old new politics, court cases, amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act, regulatory decision-making, and the creative creation and finding of loopholes. They gave rise to soft money, which is money raised outside the regulated system in amounts and from sources prohibited to federal candidates, and issue advocacy ads, which were outside spending that didn't call for the election or defeat of a candidate, but was designed to affect elections. The other sign of it, presidential candidates routinely reject public funds. Congress tried to deal with this through the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. They eliminated party soft money, curbed soft money, and issue ads for interest groups. It had limited success. There were loopholes and challenges. And one of them came from a group called Citizens United. And that challenge went to the Supreme Court. A little background. So Citizens United sought to air this movie called Hillary the movie and advertise it. And the issue was it was funded with soft money. They viewed it as a TV ad or as a TV show, a movie, and the Federal Election Commission said, oh, this is independent spending with soft money. We don't like it. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act's prohibitions against independent spending violate free speech rights, including those of corporations, unions, trade associations, and other incorporated groups. The view, money is speech, and these groups are people, or have the rights of people. Speech Now, org versus Federal Election Commission, was a quick follow-up, and basically it said that these groups that now can spend their money, as well as wealthy individuals, on independent expenditures to declare the election or defeat of a candidate, could form committees to do this, called super PACs or independent expenditure-only committees. What did the rulings do? Well, there are now more outside spending groups. There is now more outside spending. There's greater influence of wealthy individuals and groups. Some of you may know that as of June 30th of this year, there's about 158 families and corporations they control that spent donated $176 million in connection with the campaign. The interesting thing about that money is most of it's gone to outside groups. So here's another case, not Supreme Court, but public opinion. Obama versus Alito. The president said last week the Supreme Court reversed a century of law to open the floodgates for special interests to spend without limit in our elections. Justice Alito, you probably saw it on TV, frowning, shaking his head, side to side, while mouthing the words, not true. So here's the new campaign finance system. This is focusing on interest groups. It does not replace the old one, it overlays it. So from the old system, we have traditional political action committees. These are groups that raise regulated money within the regulations. They can contribute to candidates and parties. They can also make independent expenditures. To that, we have alphabet soup. We have super PACs, 527 committees, 501c or social welfare organizations that are active in politics, and corporations, trade unions, labor associations, trade associations, labor unions, and others that spend money on independent expenditures. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail on this, but I think my colleague Dave Magleby will discuss it. So what do these groups look like? Well, we now have a situation where buildings, analogous to buildings that get new rooms and other buildings nearby, architecture, we have an architecture of politics. When there's a possibility, some groups create new structures. Here's the League of Conservation Voters, basic 501c4 organization. To the right, we have the LCV Education Fund, which is the group that does research on the environmental records of candidates. Maybe you've heard of the Dirty Dozen. They're responsible for that. The LCV Accountability Project, a 501c4, publicizes that research. The LCV Political Action Committee, traditional PAC, gives contributions. The organization below it, the Super PAC, collects money from all sorts of sources, unregulated, and makes independent expenditures. The Engagement Fund raises money to support much of this. And then there are the state and local affiliates. Pretty complicated, but a lot of the same people work for all of these different facets. What did interest group spending look like in 2014? This is a biggie. I think Bob Biersack will say a little bit about it, the unreported spending activity. PAC contributions, about 42%. PAC independent expenditures, 5%. Electioneering communications, 1%. This is sort of the old world of campaign finance, the regulated part. Then we have super PACs, 27%. Whereas the 501cs, corporations, unions, independent expenditures, 20%. Then we have single candidate super PACs, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, 4%, and single candidate 501cs, which spent 1%. Key point, about 48% of the money spent in 2014 was by those regulated groups. The rest was spent by these newcomers to the political scene. And if you look back in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, 100% would have been made by the traditional groups. So There's a lot going on that's new. The effects of outside spending, just come to Iowa. More than $650 million was spent in independent expenditures to try to elect or defeat a candidate, electioneering communications of other sorts for the same purposes. There were about 18 House races where parties and interest groups outspent both candidates, another 47 where they outspent one candidate. You can include Iowa 3 in that group. The Senate, there were 9 races where the groups outspent the candidates, including in Iowa. Most of this spending is pretty negative and ugly. It's difficult for the candidates to anticipate or respond to, so they lose a little control of their message. Voters often don't get balanced information, and this weakens accountability. You might not know really what your candidate stands for or what he or she is trying to say because this group money just floods the airwaves and comes out in flyers and the rest. Okay, single candidate super PACs. This is a very important picture. These, and single candidate 501Cs. I'll talk mostly about the super PACs. These are shadow campaign committees. They exist to advance the career, the election of one politician. They raise funds from sources and in amounts that are prohibited to federal candidates. Now this oxymoron here, uncoordinated coordination, besides me playing basketball, refers to how these groups work. They're supposed to not coordinate, but the candidates appear at their events. They're the headliners. They can't raise their fundraising events. They can't ask for the money, but they can leave the room when somebody else does. There are staff ties. Former staff, former strong backers are the people who organize these single candidate super PACs and run them. And then this issue of messaging. It's illegal for them to talk to each other. But things like this happen. There's a website, not too many people know about it. It says things like, oh yeah, we've got a bunch of ads going up. Here's some film we didn't use. If some group out there wants to use it, go for it. Or the micro website may say, that was a great ad that group ran down in the southern part of my district. You know, love to see it in the northern part. No direct coordination. Anybody could see it. It's public if you can find it or want to find it. And that's why it's uncoordinated. Now, candidate super PACs and campaign committees this presidential election cycle. Red, super PAC, blue, campaign committee. Red, $103 million for George Bush's super PAC. Blue, $26 million for his official campaign committee. Hillary Clinton, did I say George Bush, Jeb Bush? I'm sorry. Hillary Clinton, to both of them. $77 million in her campaign committee, $20 million in her super PAC. Here's Walker before he dropped out. Cruz, here you have a candidate who's very close. And here you have Bernie Sanders, who's not a big believer in super PACs, and there's $25,000 in the one associated with him. I don't think he has much to do with it. And $41 million in his campaign account. I could go through the list. Here's an interesting person I'll say a few words about in a minute. Now, why do these bars look different? Well, they look different because there are different regulations, and the money comes from different sources. Unregulated outside sources, some not fully disclosed amounts and sources that these groups can't take. Regulated money originates from individual U.S. citizens making a voluntary contribution. That sort of explains it. There's one other thing that I need to talk about. The old and new fundraising dynamics. Now this chart was very hard to make. I had to overlay a lot of things on top of each other, but it's basically the old chart with the candidates' support. And I couldn't fit all the candidates on either of these, but I just want to make a statistical point. The correlation between public opinion and candidate committee receipts for official campaign committees is 91%. That's near perfect relationship. The correlation between super PACs and public opinion is non-existent. So one of the things this tells us is about the dynamics. The presidential campaign committees, the official committees, play by the old dynamic. Have initial support, a little money, use it to build an organization and advertise, build more public support, more money comes in, the bandwagon effect, there's momentum. the committee grows. Hillary Clinton started out as the early frontrunner. She had lots of support, stayed popular, continued to raise money. She has a lot of money in her war chest. Candidates like Sanders and Carson, they began this cycle as virtually invisible to most people and most donors. We know they're not that way now. We know they were able to use their initial resources to build their popularity, which helped them raise more funds and gain momentum in the process. They also succeeded, both of them, in raising quite a few contributions in amounts of less than $50. So this shows, these two candidates show how it all works. Bush started out as the early Republican establishment leader, did not rise in the polls, still has the elite money, which does not really represent the public, but has had trouble gaining traction. He's in single digits, and his official campaign account reflects that. Now, Donald Trump, the exception to all the rules. He's got a very small, maybe modest official campaign account. He didn't raise any of it. It's all from him. He doesn't have a super PAC. He's the candidate who, with a little investment, with a huge personality, and with an ability to tap into an anger of public anger and distrust, has been able to attract a lot of media attention, and he now leads the Republicans. I have a sign with 5 minutes. I'll take less. So, to conclude, Citizens United helped usher in the new politics of campaign finance. It does not completely replace the old one. When it comes to contributions, things are regulated. When it comes to independent spending, things are less regulated. There's now more outside spending groups. There's now more outside spending. The new fundraising dynamics do not respond to public opinion, but rather elite desires. The old dynamics still persist. There's now increased influence of wealthy and well-organized groups and their backers. And one thing I don't have in the slide, and I will say, is we have not returned fully to the pre-Watergate era, but we may. If possible, it may be derailed, this trend towards less regulation of money in politics, and by some kind of campaign finance reform, but I'm skeptical it will happen. I think there'd have to be a major scandal for it to take place. So thank you for your patience and listening.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Bob Biersack. He is currently working for the Center for Responsive Politics, which hosts and puts together an awesome website, opensecrets.org. Again, I use it all the time in my classes to show students trends in campaign fundraising, as well as information about spending on lobbying and other issues. I'm sure many of you know about it, but it is a great resource. Before that, he spent 30 years in the Federal Election Commission office, working, among other things, as their statistician, as a press officer, and also doing a lot of work to help improve disclosure. So I think we're going to get a really good inside look here at how things work. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. It's very nice to get to Iowa during the caucus season. The last time I was here at this time of year was in 2000. I came to give a presentation to your campaign finance regulatory organization in Des Moines. It was about 10 degrees. There was a foot of snow on the ground, and I was as sick as I think I've ever been in my life. But it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really happy, and it's such a beautiful day. It's great. We heard from Paul about a lot of controversy in this process, a lot of change that's happened in recent years, and it's absolutely true. We're dealing with some pretty fundamental principles of American politics, I think, when we talk about regulating the funding of campaigns and the way we conduct our politics. It is, as the Supreme Court often reminds us, a fundamental principle that no one can stop me, no one can restrict my ability to speak freely, particularly about public issues and issues of importance and political consideration. Most especially, nobody can stop me from complaining about the government. We see all over the world that there are examples of incentives that governments have to try to restrict that kind of behavior and to deal with free speech in that way. And it's just kind of an anathema to us that could happen. At the same time, there's another pretty basic principle that most of us hold, and that is that everybody's vote is equal to everybody else's, and everybody's entitled to the same kind of representation in this democracy that everyone else has. And so how these principles deal with each other, how they balance, how we move from one direction to the other, is the way this process gets changed. There's one aspect of it, though, that really doesn't have a whole lot of controversy in it, and that's the idea that everybody should have the information they need to make judgments on their own about how this process works and whether or not it's problematic that we have all this money from such few sources, and how we can interpret that information and make our own judgments about our political behavior is pretty fundamental. That has gotten consensus even among the Supreme Court. We have all these 5-4 decisions on these important matters, but all of them include aspects where the justices actually voted, for example, 8-1 in Citizens United, that the one thing that was valid and critically important, they said, was that this information be disclosed, that people be able to understand who's doing this and in what way. So there's broad agreement across the normally controversial boundaries here that disclosure is important, that the information is key. We certainly believe that. I've been doing it for a very long time, and the center has benefited from that and does it extraordinarily well. So I should be finished, right? There's nothing else to say. Disclosure is good. Everybody agrees. I can stop now, but maybe not so much. I'm going to talk about a couple of things. Because this is an august and academic body, I'm going to talk about some conceptual ideas first. There's a difference to me between disclosure and transparency. Disclosure is a necessary condition. It's a process that we go through in order to make the information available. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we've achieved the kind of transparency that we're looking for. Transparency is a little broader. It's that we get the meaningful information, the information that allows us to really make good judgments about what's happening. And so we're going to see some examples of disclosure and some examples of transparency and some of the challenges that we're facing in this regard. This is disclosure. This is a page from Senator Ernst's most recent campaign finance report filed with the Federal Election Commission. I'm not picking on Joni Ernst. She's an example of what happens in this context. All the members of the Senate, everybody who's involved in Senate campaigns, submits their information in actually this way, which is to say, thousands and thousands of pieces of paper with information about the donations that they receive and the expenditures that they make, paper that then has to be translated into data, into information that we can sift and understand and synthesize and get real transparency from. But that has to be done manually in this process. They're the only ones left who do it that way because the Senate's just a special place. At some point, we'll get there. I said when I left the FEC that I could see the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I can see it, and it has to do with these people taking the data that they have as data in their campaigns and just providing it that way. I'm going to talk about a couple of pieces of information. When you look at a disclosure form like this, it looks like every piece of information is roughly equal to every other. There's a name of a donor, there's an address, there's a date, an amount of the contribution, an aggregate amount from that person, because there are limits. We have to keep track of that. There's information about the employer and the occupation for that person, and what campaign it was designated for. It all kind of feels equal. There's no balance one way or the other, but in fact, it's not equal. In the context of employer versus occupation, for example, it's not enough for me to know that somebody is a medical director. You could be a medical director of anything. That's your occupation. Perhaps it's more important that this person is the medical director at Pfizer Pharmaceuticals. That tells me something more about what's happening here. Our ability to make the information transparent is contingent on our understanding of where the sources of funds are. And so we look at sectors of the economy and how those sectors behave in terms of their political behavior and their activity. You can see lots from just this little chart. There's the totals for each of the prominent sectors. There's their breakdown if they're giving directly to candidates between Democrats and Republicans. There's also the extent to which they're focused on these outside groups that Paul talked about before. Some industries much more than others. So we're learning a lot more about the context of this information. It's much more transparent when we look at it this way. Here's an example down to the level of a specific member of Congress, Paul Ryan in 2014. Now the speaker, he was a committee chair in those days. And we can see the ranking of sectors for him and compare that to the ranking of sectors for all the donors in his district who have given to any kind of political organization. So, retired people, because retired people, I kind of count myself as one. We've got disposable income that other people don't necessarily have. We may be more engaged in politics than others until we're more active. It was first for him in his support directly for his campaign committee. It's second in his district rank. But that's not consistently true through there. He's a committee chairman. And so obviously other kinds of interests focus on people like that. And they make those contributions more directly to those members than perhaps to others. Let's compare that with your own member of Congress. Here there's a different dynamic, but it's transparent. I can see it. He obviously had a competitive race. Every House race in Iowa was competitive in 2014. That's just extraordinary. So there were lots of focuses from party leaders, from members of Congress themselves, from other candidate committees that gave to him that don't necessarily do that and certainly aren't relevant in the district itself. There's also a lot of labor money in here because he's the one Democratic representative from the state that you wouldn't see perhaps in his district, but that's very important nationally, and so he gets that kind of support. Individuals are becoming more important in the process because the limits on individuals are indexed for inflation, and so therefore they grow each election cycle. It's not true for PACs. Those limits are the same as they were in 1974 when they were first created. So there's a natural evolution towards more focus on individual people. Beyond that, with this McCutcheon decision, which was the most recent Supreme Court decision that changed the rules a little bit, there's now no overall limit on how much I as a person can give to lots and lots of different members of Congress or candidates for office. That used to be limited to a little more than $100,000 altogether. That's no longer true. And so again, more focus on individual people, but not very many individual people. As you can see from this distribution, a very small percentage of people give money in meaningful amounts at all. And when we're talking about meaningful amounts now, we're talking about $2,600, which in 2014 was the limit for how much you could give to a single candidate in a single election. At the bottom, you can see that about 1,300 people give a huge percentage. 15% of all the money that came in contributions that were more than $2,600, all of it from throughout the country, were given by about 1,300 people, which is less than 1% of the number of people who made those contributions to begin with. So we're compacting the system. We're squeezing everything into a relatively small number of people. As I said, while there's general consensus, and certainly on the courts, disclosure is not a problem, the specifics of disclosure are still contentious. In the state legislature in Wisconsin, one of your neighboring states, just in the last few weeks, the legislature passed a bill that eliminates the requirement to disclose the employer of every donation. The members of the Senate who actually stopped and considered this piece of legislation, this element of it, for a couple of days before they passed it, said that, well, we still have occupation, and so we don't really need the employer. There might be threats to employers. There might be boycotts that wouldn't be necessary just because somebody gave a contribution to a candidate that wasn't popular. This is a problem. We need to stop that. Remember the role of transparency in the process. Remember how important employer information is in that context. This is not a trivial change. It's a threat to the real substance of transparency. And if it happens in a place like Wisconsin, it can happen in lots of different places. It'll be a challenge. So there are challenges to disclosure, in addition to transparency. There's a lot of words on this page, and so there's really no way to assimilate it, except to say that the bottom is a time period, how close we are to an election. And the shaded area is a period during which, by law, ads that we talked about, that Paul talked about before, that mention a candidate but don't say you should vote for this person or you should defeat this person, are not considered to be electoral at all. And so there's actually no requirement to disclose that activity to anybody, even the spending of that activity. So we have this big period of time now where we don't know how much money is being spent, but we can find out that specific groups ran 16,000 ads, for example, in this context, or 33,000 ads in the case of Americans for Prosperity, during this period when there was no disclosure at all. And then they shifted from these kinds of generic messages, but showing candidates but not telling you you should vote for them, Once these windows opened when you would have to disclose that spending, they shifted to directly advocating for or against them. They were very clear in their intention. These were the independent expenditures that we're talking about now. So we've created boundaries. The boundaries may not mean very much, and we're losing just disclosure, simple disclosure in some context there. This is another example of that process. And there's another part of the disclosure of this information that's important. And it depends on what kind of organization you are. And it's really almost impenetrable to figure out, to talk about coherently to people who aren't oriented toward the legalistic language that we use so much. Crossroads GPS at the top in blue is a 501c4 organization. It's a social welfare group that does these activities. They're trying to educate people about issues, they would say. They're also trying to educate people about particular people who support those issues or who are important in the context of what their message might be. They happen to be running for office. They spend money directly, $26 million toward the bottom on the left, directly advocating for and against candidates. They ran 16,000 ads before the time when they had to report that at all. We can keep track of that from other sources. We know how many they had. We don't know how much they spent, but we know how much how many there were. They also give money to other organizations. They gave $4.8 million to a group called Carolina Rising. Carolina Rising happened to spend 4.7 of those $4.8 million in ads advocating the election of Senator Tillis in North Carolina. That was the most contentious Senate race in 2014. He defeated an incumbent in that race. They gave money in large amounts to the Chamber of Commerce, who also spends actively in campaigns, to American Future Fund, to the Kentucky Opportunity Coalition, which supported Mitch McConnell's reelection. The point is, they're spending huge amounts of money, both directly and indirectly, by making grants to other groups. But only part of that money counts in the context of whether or not they should have to disclose their donors, most particularly. And so because they're giving it indirectly, giving it through other organizations, they don't disclose the donors. They're defeating the principle that 8 members of the Supreme Court suggested were so important. And this dynamic leads to this. This is, to the extent that we're able to know, the structure of Freedom Partners and its affiliated organizations. This happens to be, I'm almost sorry that this is true, but it happens to be the organization that was created by the Koch brothers to express their very strongly held and pretty strongly ideological views throughout the country. There are n numbers of organizations. There are hundreds of millions of dollars in this process that they do this for a reason. They're not making this up just to see how complicated they can make it. They're making it up to see how difficult it can be to keep track of who's doing what to whom, to have real transparency in the process, to have meaningful disclosure in the system. And to the extent that we have systems like this, we fall short in our ability to actually understand what's happening. And that's the challenge, I think, that represents our efforts in terms of disclosure going forward as we fight these other, as we consider, we're not going to nip at each other's nose today. We're going to talk about the challenges that we face in terms of trying to regulate the system. But it begins, to me, with being able to know what's happening, and that's much more difficult. Thank you.
Well, I agree that David Magleby needs no introduction, but perhaps I will offer one anyway, if you don't mind. I want to remind everyone also to go grab those note cards at the end of your aisle and start jotting down your questions so we can come through and grab them and get to them at the end of the talk. I'm hoping you have some by now. I'm sure I do. So our next speaker, David Magleby, is, let's see, a distinguished professor at Brigham Young University, as well as the former dean of the Family, Home, and Social Sciences College there. He is also one of the foremost experts on both campaign finance, Congress, American government, and direct democracy. He has literally written the book on American government, state government, direct democracy, as well as the books, a series of them, on campaign finance and spending in congressional elections over the last 10 or 15 years or so. And so I'm looking very forward to what he has to say to us today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Fred. I'm sorry I jumped the gun there. It's great to be in Iowa, a place where I think you all understand the context of what we're talking about today, which is that American politics is very much a team sport now in terms of how it's financed. And some of the data that was shown to you earlier by my colleagues Herrnson and Biersack illustrate that. You've seen it in Senate races, you've seen it in the Iowa caucuses, and you have seen it as a battleground state for contests for Senate and for Congress. And in that setting, what we end up seeing is that the players in this team sport of American campaign finance are first and foremost the candidates, for the reasons that Paul Herrnson alluded to. They have their own campaign committees. They're involved in their own campaign fundraising, operating within the context that Bob was talking about of disclosure, sometimes on paper, but still disclosure, and with certain limitations that are very real for them, that of course many of them would hope to avoid in some future regime of campaign finance. The second major teammate in this team sport of campaign finance is the party committees. And the party committees have long been important in a variety of ways, and they continue to be participants in this process, so that candidates form what are called joint fundraising committees with their political parties. This is especially important at the presidential level. But something not mentioned yet today is that the Supreme Court, in other decisions, McCutcheon versus the Federal Election Commission most notably, has dramatically expanded the amount of money that the party committees can raise, and we don't yet know what the impact of that will be, because this is going to be the first cycle in which we'll see this expanded party fundraising in the post-Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act period, BICRA. Congress, giving some latitude to the party committees at the end of the session in 2014 in a piece of legislation called the Cromnibus. It's an odd name. We can talk about it in Q&A if you're curious. But it included within it funding for the party committees for certain designated purposes. One of the three purposes was building funds, which, by the way, was one of the justifications given in 1979 for the amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act that brought soft money into the game. So beware of amendments about building funds, because sometimes the notion of building is very different than you might imagine. The third part of this set of players in campaign finance at the congressional and presidential level is non-candidate groups. And as has been explained, they've been in the game and then limited by BICRA, and now they're coming back in a way that feels very much like deja vu. And so I'm going to talk today about those non-candidate groups, but let me illustrate this with data from your own state about the importance on the hard money side, the candidates as teammates side, of the Iowa caucus. It can generate substantial momentum. So the bright red line is what had been raised as of January 2012, about the time that you all were voting in your caucuses. And then by April, what had the candidates raised? And the two lines together would equal the total. You can see that there was a substantial bump for Romney, and for reasons you understand very well, not nearly as much of a bump for Santorum. Where were those ballots anyway? What's fascinating to me is that even though he was not challenged, Obama was not inactive in campaign finance and had done quite well in this period of the off-year fundraising, the odd-numbered year that we're just finishing up now. And that was important in the game of the 2012 election, that fundraising. And so the candidates and their allied supporters, and at the presidential level, the party committees tend not to be as active in the nomination phase. And generally, they've not been as active in the nomination phase in congressional races. That's changed a little bit because of the involvement of some outside groups in recent cycles. Now, let's talk a little bit about outside groups and who these non-candidate groups are. The first thing to say is that since the passage of the Federal Election Campaign Act, 1974, the court ruled in the 76 decision, Buckley versus Vallejo, that independent expenditures must be allowed. They would be fully disclosed. And so groups have long had, and individuals have long had, the ability to make independent expenditures. And some individuals acting on their own did so as early as the 1976 cycle. But that was fairly limited. What we're seeing now in this world of super PACs is individuals coming into the game through an organizational mechanism they don't have to start themselves, that comes with consultants and lawyers and advisors, and all they have to do is write the check. Super PACs. I've created a bit of a typology of super PACs. The first thing to say is that when, as was alluded to by Paul in the conversation at the State of the Union address with Obama, most people thought the big danger with super PACs was going to be the involvement of corporations and unions who would be able to use their general treasury funds and could overwhelm the system. Imagine Apple or Microsoft, or you pick it, being able to commit funds from their general treasury into a campaign super PAC. And hence that discussion was often focused on those two players and the possibility that they would overwhelm the system. The reality has been that it's been far more driven by individual donors, many of them with privately held corporate ties, but it has been largely an individual donor-driven phenomenon. And there are, I think, three types. The first one, and by far the most important one, is the candidate-specific super PAC. I think it's fair to say candidate-aligned super PAC. This is a phenomenon in which individuals often leave the employ of the candidate and become the head of the super PAC, knowing very well who the friends of the candidate are, and is able to therefore solicit funds in very large amounts that would not have been possible under FECA or BICRA. So candidate-specific super PACs, and those are the ones I'll be talking about mostly today. Second type would be what we might call party-centered super PACs. And in that instance, and you've seen evidence of this in your Senate race here and in other contests in the House, the leadership of Congress has worked fairly quickly, soon after Citizens United and Speech Now, to form party-centered super PACs for the House and Senate. The exception was Republicans in the Senate who did not form such a super PAC following the decision in 2010, and only recently have formed one. Rather, they depended upon a party-centered super PAC named Crossroads, headed by Karl Rove and Stephen Law and others. But Mr. McConnell has now formed a super PAC for Senate Republicans, and those groups spend in the key battleground races. You've heard mention of the North Carolina race in Bob Biersack's remarks, party-centered super PACs. The third type is ideological or interest group super PACs, and they are also important. They tend to be driven more by issues, and Paul illustrated one with the League of Conservation Voters. Then there are Section 501c groups. Section 501c is a part of the IRS code. 501c3 groups are the groups you're most familiar with. They're charitable organizations for which a contribution to those groups is a tax-deductible contribution. They tend to, at least in the past, have assiduously avoided being involved in electoral politics. And there's now, I think, some controversy brewing about the involvement of some of these groups who do the background research that Bob Biersack referred to that then gets used by the more political parts of Section 501c4, which is supposedly a social welfare organization whose primary purpose is not politics or elections. Well, what does primary purpose mean? That's the rub. And then two other 501c groups worth mentioning. 501c5 groups are labor unions. They're organized under that section, and trade associations under 501c6, the largest of which, the Chamber of Commerce, is a major player in this sphere. So you don't want to just focus on C4s. You need to remember C5s and C6s, especially C6s. Now, candidates have increasingly gotten involved in all of these types with fewer examples of the C3s for understandable reasons. Let me illustrate this with some campaigns. Rubio has the Conservative Solutions PAC, which is his super PAC, But he has the Conservative Solutions Project, which is 501c4. Now, what's the difference? Well, the donors to the C4 are not disclosed. It's back to Bob's point about the importance of disclosure. I've been told by some consultants in Washington that when they meet with donors in a room like this, they will say, how do you feel about disclosure? If you feel like you can have your identity disclosed, then we'd really like you to give first to the candidate, and then at the max out level, and then to the super PACs, because that's the most efficient way for us to spend your dollars. But if you don't want to be disclosed, you can give to our 501c4 over here in this corner. Please go over there. Sounds like the Iowa caucus next month. Then, if you don't want to be disclosed and you want a tax deduction, we have formed a research entity that's going to meet over here, and we'd appreciate you going there. And that is the sorting kind of process that's happening with campaign finance. Let me continue with Cruz. He has at least 3 super PACs that bear the name Keep the Promise, and he's attached, much like the Super Bowl, Roman numerals after them, Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3. What's fascinating about his super PACs is that they are largely funded by individual billionaires who seem not to want to play together. So they're teammates, but they really want their own super PAC. So it's a Keep the Promise Roman numeral 1, funded by one billionaire, and so forth. And I could give you the names of the billionaires, thank heavens, because the super PAC disclosure is released. Bush is another example. Bush started the Right to Rise Leadership PAC in January of 2014. That was an exploratory committee in the conventional way candidates have often done this. Then he started the Right to Rise Super PAC 1 year later in January 2015. This is that period, you'll remember, when Bush was running, but he would say he was not running, except once when it slipped, and then he had to correct himself. No, I'm not really running, even though I'm here. And then he started the Right to Rise Policy Solutions, a 501c4 organization. Now, if your head's spinning by trying to keep track of all this, welcome to the world of a reporter today who's trying to understand what money's going where. But go back to my analogy of being in the room and being told, if you want to help Bush, go into that corner or this corner based upon your disclosure preferences. Now, super PACs are often funded by very wealthy people. This is a chart that illustrates from 2012 the number of people who gave $1 million contributions or more to the super PACs whose names you've since forgotten, since these are names meant to engender warm feelings but being eminently forgettable, like Priorities USA, which is still involved, it's now Clinton's, Restore Our Future. Future was a big deal in 2012. Romney and Gingrich and others used Future a lot. What did super PACs do in 2012? Well, this is a chart that gives you some sense of the overall spending by these super PACs. Remember, Future being important. 153 million for Romney, and overall 250 million when you add in Crossroads and other money. Both Romney and Obama, in the aggregate, when all is added together, spent over $1 billion in 2012. But the difference in where the money came from is remarkable. 3/4 of Obama's money came from individual donors. Half of Romney's money came from individual donors. Romney did much better among super PACs. Obama not as well. Romney did much better among 501c organizations. Obama not as well. So there is a bit of a partisan sorting here, with Republicans exploiting the outside money options at present more than others. What did the super PACs do? What was the consequence in 2012? And therefore, what do we look for in 2016? First, it prolonged the race. It made the race longer for reasons, I think, that Paul alluded to with his data. It introduced negativity into the race that then the other side could use in the general election. The best example is Boehmke, which was brought up by Gingrich in the primaries and returned to by Obama in the general election. Super PACs are going to be important again. This is data from June from the Wall Street Journal. It shows some projected additional data through the next reporting period. The key point has already been alluded to, which is that Bush is far and away been doing the best in super PAC fundraising. They are a necessary but not sufficient condition for candidates to compete these days. And the reason they're not sufficient means look at people like Mr. Walker. who did relatively well with outside money. It is not going to get you there, but without it, I think most candidates would worry a lot about being competitive. Again, it's being used more by Republicans than Democrats in this cycle. 501c groups were important. Let me talk to you a little bit about some controversies that are brewing and important to watch. One is timing. Super PACs are changing the timing of when candidates announce their entry into the race. I mentioned the Bush example a moment ago. They call it the testing the waters stage. They delay the announcement of their official candidacy so they can do more of that Super PAC fundraising, as illustrated by Bush's success. A big challenge with disclosure. The more money that's going to the C3s and C4s and C6s, the bigger the challenge we have in knowing who's actually funding these races. Another challenge is in coordination. Is there coordination between the candidates and these super PACs? And this is a research topic that I'll be exploring in this cycle, for example. Then the function of super PACs has changed. In 2010 and 2012, it was largely television advertising. But what you're seeing in 2016 here in Iowa and in other places is a much more multifaceted use of super PACs as a campaign entity, where they're involved in GOTV, where they're involved in hosting events, as with Carly Fiorina's campaign, where they may be running the turnout GOTV operation, something that I want to learn a little bit about tonight and tomorrow here in Iowa. Disclosure remains a major concern, and especially as has been illustrated in the 501c4 world. As those players become more and more important, what does that bode for the future of our elections? And then the transfers of funds from these undisclosed entities, the C4s and others, into the areas of super PACs, so that you can raise money in a C4 and then transfer it into a super PAC and reap the benefits of the higher ratio of spending allowable. So again, it's great to be back in Iowa, where next to Ohio, I would say you're the epicenter of all of this, and you're the epicenter for a longer period than Ohio. For that, you have every reason to be very proud. Thanks to be.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Robin Kolodny. She's a professor of political science at Temple University and spent 1 year in Congress working for Nancy Johnson of Connecticut through an American Political Science Association congressional fellow position. She's an expert on campaign finance and political consulting. And one of the things I've used a lot of her work on what happened after BICRA in my class, and one of the things that it reminds me of working in this area is that every 5 to 10 years, all of a sudden, a bunch of the rules change, and you got to update all your lectures and presentations and figure out how the system itself has changed. So I'm looking forward to finding about what's new in campaign finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent research that I've done, but I'm actually going to do it somewhat quickly because I'm in the cleanup position. So I'd like to respond a little bit to what some of my colleagues before me have said. One reason I want to is because I consider myself a scholar of political parties and of congressional elections. And so I came to campaign finance because of those questions. And so I'm not primarily interested in campaign finance for its own sake. You'll see where I'm going. So the first thing that I want to point out is that what Diana Dwyer and I did, we presented this at a conference earlier this year, is looked about at the division between inside and outside groups, if there is one, in House elections. So the thing that I would like to point out is, let's see, I've got the wrong, is that, first of all, a lot of the discussion that we hear about these issues focuses on the presidency and focuses also on this division between the idea of inside and outside sources. So in the party world these days, there's a lot of emphasis on an extended party network theory, which is to say that perhaps interest groups aren't a concern as much as people make them out to be, because if they are just other manifestations of political party goals, then maybe we're concerned about the wrong kind of thing. So what we looked at is some of the major players in the 2014 House elections to see if we can categorize them as being inside the network or outside the network. And also we're concerned about whether political parties are still central in the system, because after all, that's one of the things that we seem to conclude about democracies is that parties are central. And so if the parties are doing well and people identify with the parties, then the rest of the system may be doing all right. So the first thing that I want to show you here is that this is a chart of total outside spending by non-party groups from 2004 to 2014. And it is in current dollars, so it hasn't been adjusted for inflation. And let me first point out to you the green lines. So the first green line, the nice big one, is in 2012. So this is the outside spending in the 2012 presidential election that came about because of Citizens United, right? We had an easier way to spend that money. But let me also point out to you that the 2004 line, it's a shorter line, but this is before Citizens United. Some of you may recall Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. So as Dave Magleby just pointed out, you didn't really need a super PAC to go ahead and mount an independent campaign that was ideologically driven and that wasn't disclosed in the traditional manner. You just had to use a clunkier mechanism for that. It even went down a little bit in 2008, but now look at these red lines. That's the outside spending in Senate races. And as you can see in 2014, the reason why we talked a lot about it and we studied this extensively is that there were a lot of very important Senate races in 2014, and the control of the chamber. I don't know, what have I done? The control of the chamber was in play, and in fact, it did change party control. So there was an enormous amount of spending on Senate races. But by contrast, look at what the blue lines are showing us with the House, is that there have been some years, 2006 when control of the House changes, in 2010 where you see that there was more spending, but in 2014 it goes down even, and it's commensurate with levels 4 years ago. So this is what I want you to think about as we go forward. So when you are looking at interest group spending, you'd have to ask yourself whether they're affiliated groups, affiliated with the central party mission, or whether they're outside. And that's what Dave Magleby shows you, all the different kinds of groups. That's one of the questions that we're really begging there, is how much they're doing this. And then, of course, how much some of those groups might be acting as proxies for political parties. Several of our speakers talked about how the parties are reluctant to get involved in primaries. And in some states, by the way, they can't do that. So an interest group that has your interests at heart might be a good proxy for doing that. And also, parties act predominantly in general elections because of the competitiveness issue, and that is that they're concerned with at the end which party controls the seat, not necessarily the personality or the name of the person that's in there. And some of these, if a group is affiliated, it should align with this kind of party behavior, and anti-establishment groups will act differently. So now I'm about to show you some network analyses that we engaged in, if I can get the right thing. Before I do that, we looked at, and this is just the 2014 House elections, the network of congressional campaign committees, prominent interest groups, prominent super PACs, and what we hypothesized as contrarian interest groups. We haven't talked very much. I mean, there's a little bit of an undertone in this campaign about the Tea Party and Freedom Works and things like this. Have they seen their last day? Are they really, how far outside of the mainstream are they? Likewise, we looked at the Service Employees International Union on the Democratic side, which is one of the largest and most important unions in the United States, and also traditionally has farther left than mainstream Democratic positions. In addition, we looked at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and the House Majority PAC. And as I have here with the asterisks, we expect these other groups to be opposed to the party's central mission. The other part of this context to consider is that even in 2014, which is a midterm election year, you see that the number of races where each of these political actors spent the funds, by and large, with the exception of SEIU, and the Chamber of Commerce, is less than it even had been in 2012. So we do have a problem with a number of competitive races that are still there, but it's really remarkable how little even the party committees were engaged. All right, so here's my first network analysis graph to show you. This is the Republican primary network in 2014, and the blue boxes are those spenders in that network that I was talking to you about. Chamber of Commerce is up there on the top, and then the Freedom Works, the NRCC is there on the bottom, and then all off to its lonesome is American Crossroads. And the measures that we have here show us something very interesting and maybe somewhat unexpected, that in the primaries, it's the Chamber of Commerce that is the most central actor in this. What the little red lines show you is that those that are on the outside, those are the races that only that actor engaged in. The ones toward the middle, where you see multiple lines, those are the races that more than one of these actors engaged in. So you can see that there's some very interesting, but as you'll see in other slides I'll quickly show you, this is actually a very diffuse. There's not a lot of races that we're talking about here that any of these actors spent in. What it turned out was that the NRCC and the Chamber of Commerce overlapped in 5 races in the primaries where they both supported the same side. So we see very clearly that even though the Chamber is spending separately from the party, they're doing the same kinds of things. They're echoing the party's goals. And then what's also interesting in that previous graph is that there are also 5 races where Freedom Works and the Chamber were the only 2 groups, Chamber of Commerce, that spent in these primaries, but in 3 of them, 2 of them are funny because of this situation when a House member can run for Senate and how they were doing something differently there. But in these bottom 3, Idaho, Ohio, Texas, they are explicitly opposing each other. That is, every time the Tea Party starts to engage, the Chamber of Commerce engages against their goals. And finally, there's only 2 races, really, where all 3 groups spent. And you can see similar kinds of things happening as well, that Freedom Works and the Chamber are consistently opposing the NRCC in that one California race spent on the incumbent early on, who then later said he was going to retire. So there's a very limited amount of overlapping activity, but it still tells us something. For the general election, now look at the NRCC, right? That is a much denser graph, many more races that the party is being involved in, and only a few that where they're overlapping with the other actors. Oh, I didn't mention in both of these, you can see that American Crossroads, the big super PAC that everybody was concerned about in the last couple of cycles, is virtually absent from the House races. They have this is the general election, and they've only spent in 3 House races. They were spending on the Senate. They weren't spending on the House almost at all. So here you see that there are a few races. Sometimes Freedom Works and the NRCC are on the same page in the general. Sometimes they're still apart here. But look at the Chamber. This is the Chamber of Commerce spends only on a very small number of races in the general election, and nearly all of them overlap with the party. Quickly, the Democratic Party network, you see that the Service Employees International Union is involved in a lot of races, more in the primaries than the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, yet a good dose of this overlaps. Also, look at the House Majority PAC, again, a party-connected PAC. This is the one where it's interesting when Bob Biersack's talking about disclosure. The other thing, if you look at these things long enough, other things pop out at you, is that if the names don't work, sometimes the address tells you a lot. So it turns out that if you mail a check to Steny Hoyer's campaign committee or you mail it to the House Majority PAC, you're sending it to the same address. That's another clue, that there might be a little inkling of what's going on in there. So here you see that the SEIU is giving some kind of support to many, many candidates that nobody else is, but also the House Majority PAC isn't giving to anybody that's not already supported, and very few. However, then, in the general election network, here you can see that the bigger actor is Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. It's involved with any race that it considers to be competitive. And again, only a few races got support from the House Majority Super PAC that didn't already overlap with the same kinds of races. So what we found, though, in more of the discussion about these two networks is actually the SEIU didn't perform a role where they were opposing the party in the way that the FreedomWorks Tea Party people were in the Republican network. And that's partly because that the Democrats had many fewer competitive primaries than the Republicans did in the House in 2014. And so we still find, though, that, and this is, I guess, one of the questions that I would pose to you, is that the more things change, the more things stay the same, it may seem, is that the formal party organizations still seem to be the central actors in these networks of who's spending where and on what. Now, remember that what's going on for you right now is a struggle for the nominations of the two parties before the formal party organizations are even supposed to be involved. And so that can be a very different thing. And as I'll emphasize again, it's presidential, right? The Senate can sometimes have some of this, but the House very rarely sees this kind of activity. And major non-party group spending is often congruent with these party goals, except for FreedomWorks. And the Chamber of Commerce, actually, if you follow this in real time, they have, since the Tea Party's emergence, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in particular, has done the kind of thing that would be difficult for the Republican Party organization to do, is come right out and said, we don't like some of these guys. In fact, if you voted the wrong way on the debt ceiling, we're going to get involved because we completely disagree with that position. So I'm going to end this, but hold on, I'm not done. So there are three major points as you're picking up your cards and thinking about questions to ask my colleagues and myself that I'd like you to think a little more broadly about. The first thing is corporate influence or outside money? Because a lot of times when we're saying outside money, that's what we mean. Is it worse than before? Because this is what a lot of the discussion is about, right? Is that if there's more groups and there's more money, then clearly more stuff is going on and more distortion occurs. And so I would push back a little bit on that assertion because I would say we don't really know. We're data-driven people, and that's great. And the reality is that we started collecting good data in 1976 and probably much better data starting in 1978. But what do we know about the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s up until FICA? We know very little. We have anecdotes. We had terrible disclosure under the Federal Corrupt Practices Act. I can go on forever. But I think that there is a lot of history that some people in this room would remember, experienced in real time, about what corporations, for example, would do or wouldn't do that wouldn't have necessarily risen to the level of campaign spending on television, because that wasn't really how you achieved influence in Congress. I'll get to more about this in a second. In the post-FICA era to the early 1990s was a time when you had campaign disclosure, but you could give congressmen gifts. And we're not talking about, a couple of football tickets here or there that sometimes seems to get the journalists very upset. I'm talking about investigative missions to the Caribbean and to Europe and to place, I've got a colleague here who remembers these kinds of things. It's not until we have an explicit gift ban that the ways in which you would influence members had to all be disclosed. People didn't go ahead and put all of the stuff down on there, and it was really pretty common to be the case. The same thing now about lobbying prohibitions. At the last APSA conference, I was at a panel where somebody was talking about thank you, I finally just see that, lobbying prohibitions on members once they leave. And that is true. They clamped down on that significantly, but apparently not on being on a corporate board. And in fact, the fellow who was doing this research found that the average amount of time that it took for a member of Congress upon their retirement or defeat to be appointed to a corporate board was 5 days. 5 days. So there is, to me, that open question. The growth of the number of groups is also something that I want to speak to for just a second. Are all of them active? That's really the important question. We have a lot of PACs, but what I have found, my husband's a venture capitalist, is that if it doesn't cost you anything to maintain it, why would you close it down? You don't know in this environment what the Supreme Court's going to say is illegal. You don't know what other kind of regulatory rule may come down that changes things. So the question is more if all those groups are active. Second, about disclosure. I have been doing other research on this, and what gets lost often in the conversation is that we are by far the most transparent system in the world. In the world, there is no other country that will give you this level, flawed though it may be, of disclosure. And so part of the question is whether should we strive to be even more disclosed than this, because what are we getting in return for that? The other thing, by the way, is that I also found that no democracy, and I have to underscore this, no democracy can keep private money out of their system. I don't care how much you've heard about public funding in other places. They can't decide what's the best way. Do you give the funding through the parties? Do you give the funding to the candidates? And no matter what has happened, I can cite you many examples, every single democracy can't keep somebody who's determined, like a Sheldon Adelson, from spending their money from doing it. It just can't be done. And the last thing, and I think the most important, which you'll take up on the other panel, I feel certain, is to ask yourself about what these super PACs are spending on. Dave Magleby said now they're getting in to get out the vote in events, but consistently they had been spending enormous amounts on television. The ones when Paul Herrnson talks about the 18 races where outside groups outspent, he's absolutely right, but it's virtually all on television. And so now I'm going to talk to this group, you students in the room. This is something that actually has frustrated me enormously, is that you think of yourselves as students right now and not necessarily the leaders of politics in another 10 or 15 years. And let me say this to you. How many of you are watching television in real time? I got a 17-year-old. She consumes all sorts of TV. But you have all figured out how to avoid all the ads. Haven't you figured this out, right? So you know you can get the content that you want without the messages that you don't want to receive. What our colleagues in political behavior have found out, I'm hoping some people will comment on this in the next one, is that, you know what, there's a saturation effect. Even if you can be persuaded by TV ads, after 6 or 8 or 16 showings, you're not paying attention anymore. What we also found in political science is that the door-to-door shoe leather personal connection is much more effective than spending on television commercials are, and yet some of the real value of that is not accounted for in the way that we disclose campaign spending, because if you all are spending 100 hours a week volunteering for a campaign, what's that worth to the campaign? It's invaluable what it's worth to the campaign, but it doesn't get reported as a cost that's spent. And so social media turns out to be very cheap, right? And the amount that you could spend on Facebook or other kinds of platforms compared to the television take is really considerable. So finally, I would say to you, don't cede your power to cash. And I think that that would be the message that I would send, is that you need to talk, it's not like money isn't important, but you need threshold amounts, not absolute parity. It's not an arms race. We have many examples of self-financed candidates who lose spectacularly. I'm thinking of Linda McMahon in Connecticut. $80 million she spent one cycle, $100 million to get in the U.S. Senate, and she, I think in the last one, she got beat by a fellow who spent $20 million. So this is the thing that I would like you to focus on. Herrnson also talked about how the super PAC money is not at all correlated with public support. That ought to tell you something right there, right? Is just because people can can put the money in the account doesn't mean that they're going to lead to victory. So I'll end there, but with my call to power for the young people who are going to make these decisions in the future.
Going to channel some of that. Actually, I'm going to show my students all of this. But that echoes a lot of things that I like to tell them after we show those charts of how much money there is in politics. So I have a collection of questions here. We're happy to have more come in. I thought I would start out with one that sort of jumped through my mind, since this is a symposium on political discourse. Thought it might be useful to start out by having some of the panelists talk about what they view as the relationship between campaign finance spending and campaign finance reform on the discourse surrounding elections. So if perhaps a couple of you or all of you want to comment on that. We have about 30, 35 minutes for questions, and I have a decent stack here, so let's not use it all on my question. But anyone wants to? David?
I can start off. I would say that the implications of the outside money, the literature would show us, has been that it makes campaigns more negative. The implicit division of labor between the teammates is that the outside groups will do the attack, and the candidate campaigns will be responsible for the positive messaging, candidate definition kinds of ads. And the assumption in the past has been that the candidates were going to be responsible, or the parties, for the get out the vote efforts. Clearly that was the Obama model. So I think one of the implications of outside money is it leads to more negative campaigning than we would otherwise have, although I think there's lots of reasons why campaigns will go negative themselves.
I think we agree.
Okay.
Actually, I'm not sure I do. In the days of soft money for the parties in the 90s, it was the parties who spent on negative ads. And so in the absence of some other organization that's going to do that, the parties are certainly going to jump in. I mean, they do it in part because the perception, at least, is that they work. They provide information for people. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, even unseemly, but people seem to learn from it to some extent. It's not as effective as door-to-door, but it's still there. It also generates 15% to the people who buy that television. And so to some extent, we have a system that's captured by the professionals who run it. Right. And it's their incentives that are often as important as the incentives of the candidates, who are risk-averse, we heard, and so they're not going to take a chance. But the discourse, I'm not sure it's so good.
Well, no, I should thank you, because I think it prompts a qualification to the statement. I think party soft money was outside money. It couldn't be coordinated with the candidates, and it was very much like issue advocacy and super PAC spending today. And party committees used soft money for voter activation purposes, the 72-hour task force kinds of expenditures. So, fair point.
So I have an excellent stack of questions here. Your comments reminded me of one of them. You talked about the people running the campaign committees, thinking about the structure of the system, not wanting to change it. One of the questions was, all of the people who would be voting to reform the system are incumbents, and in most cases have at least not done too poorly in the system because they were elected. And so if you could talk a little bit about what it would take to get the incumbents who have succeeded in this system to consider reforming it.
That's an excellent question.
It's not mine.
Right, because I would like to point out on that note that if you look at the 1974 FICA Act in particular, you will see that the way that it treats presidential candidates is far more restrictive and punitive than the way they treated themselves. And this is legislation that was written with the help of some outside groups, but of course drafted by members of Congress. And a lot of the things that came even out of the first important Supreme Court case, Buckley versus Vallejo, that were striking down things even that made Congress freer. So that's a great, it's going to be very difficult.
The common answer is that they need to feel uncomfortable, so uncomfortable about the system as it works, that they feel like they need to change it for their own protection. That was the case in 1974 after the Nixon campaign. Everybody felt like the system was rigged and it wasn't fair and it was in fact criminal in some cases. And so we needed to change it. The same thing happened in 2002. It took a long time to get there, but the soft money system for the parties became really untoward, and Congress felt like they needed to change it in order to protect themselves. So in the history, that's the mechanic.
I would just jump in and say that a lot of this is practical, but there are also some philosophical considerations. Generally speaking, Republicans believe in the free market of ideas. They do not want government regulation, and they generally don't want welfare for politicians, and that's how this is often phrased. Democrats swing a little bit more towards equality and the little man, and they favor more regulation. They tend to favor public funding and things of those sorts. Once you get beyond philosophy and you get to the practical politics, there's partisanship. You don't want to anger your leaders, even if you disagree with some of the reforms they're backing or opposing. But most of all, you don't want to upset your constituents. And that means your voting constituents who may be aware of such a bill, which happens following a major crisis like the Watergate crisis or the Keating 5 scandal or any of those kinds, or the Enron scandal or any of those kinds of things. And then the second constituency, which is your financial constituency. Members of Congress, candidates for almost all office, wage two campaigns, one for votes and the other for resources, and they need to make their constituents happy, but also not eliminate parts of those constituencies. If we think about how women raise their money, it differs from men. Women's money is generally more national, given more by women themselves. Men tend to raise most of their money. Well, they raise it nationally, but not so much from women. And there are ethnic and racial networks. One of the big issues is how much money is in your constituency. People who live in wealthy constituencies like suburban Connecticut, New York City area, Hollywood, Houston, they can raise their money at home, and they would surely back the incumbents. Bills that would say, okay, you can only raise money from in your district, whereas candidates from less wealthy districts, particularly challengers, need to rely on money nationally. So there are a whole slew of philosophical, partisan, as well as practical considerations that stand in the way of reform. And of course, incumbents hold different positions from challengers, often until the challengers become incumbents.
Fred, let me just add one thing. I think there's a difference between how incumbents deal with laws they get to write, which tend to be favorable to themselves, and laws they inherit from the court. And the example of the second category would be the super PACs phenomenon. And what's fascinating to me is the extent to which there's learning going on at different levels or in different institutions. So we saw these candidate-aligned super PACs first in the presidential race, but now they are becoming much more commonplace in congressional races. So there's ongoing adaptation in both parties and across institutions. And so we're going to see in 2016 far more Senate candidate-specific super PACs formed and even more House candidate-specific aligned super PACs formed, which tends to alter in some ways the ways the parties interact and the way donors are going to be interacting and the campaign dynamics for the reasons we've talked about.
Okay, thank you. We appear to have a wealthy benefactor in our midst. I am writing a multi-million-dollar check to a PAC. What is the expected return on investment to justify such an amount, or is it purely emotionally or philosophically driven? So what's the return on these donations?
It better be to a super PAC that can accept unlimited contributions from a variety of sources, or it's illegal. Many of us work for Congress, and I've seen a member blow a stack and throw a union leader or union lobbyist out of his office because the lobbyist said, Congressman, we supported you, and now we'd like you to help us out and back our bill. And he said, are you suggesting a quid pro quo? I know you're new at this job, and I'm going to ask you to leave now, but if you ever come in with that line again, I'm going to call your boss and have you fired. And this is a very powerful member of the House. And is quite amazing. What's your payback? Generally, we know from the political science literature is that you will at least get a voice with a member of Congress, a meeting, that someone else probably will not. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rule. If you're the leader of a major organization that doesn't give contributions but has a big impact on the district, sure you'll get in. But money is one of those things that will help. The other way that you get a return on your investment is if there's little turnover, there's little change. And political scientists and some economists for years have been chasing the relationship between money and roll call votes and having a lot of difficulties methodologically, but also empirically finding it. And part of the reason is most of these established groups that continue to give large amounts of money, continue to lobby, support the status quo. And the status quo is very hard to change in a system that has so many veto points, separation of powers, federalism, and all those things. So I don't think you're going to get a huge return, but you certainly are going to get some great pictures and great stories.
The returns are almost never so incremental. It's almost never, I'll give you this so I get this specific thing in return. The courts say that's where you can regulate things. You can limit contributions for individual people because I'm giving you something. So maybe I expect something in return. So the government's allowed to protect itself from that kind of specific. A lot of times I think they're ideological, especially when they get to that size. People are really strong believers in a way that the government should work, in a perspective. Sometimes they're playing a very long game. I think the wealthy benefactors for libertarian kinds of orientations now are really trying to change the way the government functions. And if it takes 20 years or 30 years or more, that's okay. We can do that. And so it's not so much what am I going to get tomorrow, it's how can I shape the process going forward so that someday we'll have a government that actually works the way I think it should.
Well, I would respond in a similar vein. It's true that political science has not been successful in finding the smoking gun. There's no receipt, for one amendment, this amount received. But the other way to look at it for the multimillionaire is that maybe you're not buying change, you're buying the status quo. That the status quo works for you, and so what you would like is to make sure that there isn't a change. There are a couple other things in here. One is that there has been a little study of some of these people as hobbyists. Some really rich people like to race yachts, and some of the rich people, like Paul Herrnson is saying, like to collect photographs, cufflinks, and stories, and point to their friends and say, "See that ad, last week? That was me." Right. So there's a little bit of that. But finally, to the status quo, I often tell my students to think of this in terms of your car insurance. We all pay for car insurance, but after 20, 30 years of paying your auto insurance, and you can pay a substantial amount over that period of time, you don't say, well, gee, you know what, let me wrap my car around a tree because I need to collect on that investment. If you're lucky, you'll never collect. And so if you think about why some people who have a lot of potential stakes are making the outlays that they are, this is the similar kinds of things. So maybe, and the story that Paul told is great because a lot of us have similar stories, but when you're in trouble, you call your agent up and you say, I have a claim to make. And if you think of it that way, that is what a lot of big investors in the system want, is that should they need it, they could have the access, but they prefer not to ever use it.
A couple of thoughts. One is building on the access point, I think, and the hobbyist point. I think there are good examples of that. My favorite example would be Foster Freeze, who was Santorum's sidekick. You'll remember that in Iowa, and often appeared with him on the stage. So this is the major benefactor of the Santorum Super PAC. Obviously, part of the inner circle that comes down onto the stage after Santorum's on election nights as that race unfolded. So you get access, and in some cases you may get really extraordinary access to the candidate. I think ideological is a major motivation, and part of this is the relative wealth of the individuals. I mean, we think of this as a lot of money. I'm not sure they think of it as a lot of money, and therein lies an interesting distinction. Now, if you are an investor that's in it for the long term, not just this election cycle, then there's a whole array of investment options that we can put before you, including think tanks on both sides, ideological groups. Just in the super PACs area, if you don't want to really go in just for one candidate, then you can give to Crossroads and trust Karl Rove and Mr. Law and others, or you can give to the Senate Majority PAC or the House Majority PAC on the Democratic side and trust them, as a good broker would do, to allocate your millions appropriately. But you may be really aware that having really good video archives of misstatements made in Indiana Senate races, for example, might be useful. And so you might be willing to give $5 million to your party to build the data archive to help every other super PAC have the ability to respond. Highly specialized investment options that are now developing within this world of mega donors. And then you can go to an LLC and form a data archive. Both parties now have them. 200 million names. They know all about those 200 million people, such that they can profile you for purposes of mobilization, fundraising, and other things. Again, funded initially by people who are willing to invest, in this case in an LLC at Catalyst, and a similar entity on the Republican side, plus an additional entity funded by the Koch brothers network. So there's a lot of ways to spend your money.
And then there's the example of the state of North Carolina, where a fellow named Art Pope, who's the Tom Steyer or David Koch of North Carolina, invested in lots of legislative races over a few years, invested in getting a Republican elected governor of North Carolina. Now, and again, it's not just the money that does this, but certainly it was important to him. And his payoff was a bureaucratic job. He became the budget director for the state of North Carolina. He didn't need the salary, but he wanted to change the way budgeting worked in the state. He wanted to change the way we use public money, and he wanted to do it directly. He's a hands-on kind of guy. He ran businesses, and so he was happy to do that. So sometimes it can be kind of more alert.
I'm going to try and do a couple of quick questions here that I think are partly clarifications or just general information, response to some of the presentations. So let me start here. How much money comes from foreign interests in this case?
I can tell you an anecdote.
That may be a long answer, it sounds like.
You know, I guess the best answer is, for the most part, we don't know. But at one point in my career, I did a political audit for a major foreign company that had a U.S. subsidiary. And they asked me to come in, and I said, well, if I'm going to come in, I'm going to do some work, and we'll talk. So I looked up their political action committee, and the biggest donor gave the legal maximum, $5,000, had a very foreign-sounding name, and was the head of the company and did not reside in the United States. So I showed up, and I commented them about their PAC holding back some money so they could give it to people who defeated the incumbents that they supported, kiss and make up money, and the PAC director and everyone glowed with pride. I said, it's great the way you've reserved some funds for this and that, but I have a question. This person here, is he an American citizen? Because if he's not, it's illegal. Well, everyone turned beet red. The meeting ended, and they sent me a check and said, you know, I think maybe we shouldn't keep you going. And then I checked the records that Bob is in charge of keeping, and that contribution had been withdrawn. But that's an example. And it was an example before we had the internet set up the way it is and before social media, that if it had happened now, this candidate, this PAC would have been in trouble, and the candidates that received PAC money might have been in jeopardy because they would have been associated with foreign contributions, and that could have been a scandal. So I don't think it's much, but we don't really know. And with these new groups, it's harder to tell.
That's a pretty innocent example. That was almost surely done from ignorance. We didn't realize I couldn't give this contribution. And it was disclosed. So obviously they weren't trying to hide very much. I did, at the end of my career in the federal government, I spent some time going around the world to talk to other developing democracies and other kinds of people, and often in Latin America. And my Mexican colleagues would always look at me askance and say, how in the world can you believe that there's no drug money in American politics? How is that even conceivable to you? That sounds really apocryphal, and it makes everybody nervous and a little jingoistic, and I'm never comfortable with those conversations because I do think we have a genuinely pretty straightforward and for the most part honest process. But it's always the devil you don't know that feels like the one that's the real problem. And there are many more avenues now to be that devil that we just don't know. And there are lots of people with the same kind of incentives that our friends who give $1 million contributions above board have, but that would never do it in that way. So I try to be not so sanguine about this problem, this potential problem, because we don't know.
So since you brought up, sorry, I want to move through these. Since you brought up the idea of drugs and drug laundering, that actually leads into my next question in a way. Which was on one of your slides, whether or not, when you're talking about freedom partners, whether or not that met the definition of financial money laundering, Bob.
Freedom, I don't.
Freedom partners?
Transfers.
The way they're moving all the money through the system.
It depends on what judge or lawyer you talk to. Yeah, I think in a common sense way, I'd absolutely suggest money laundering. And in fact, there is still a law in the books that says you can't give a contribution in the name of someone else. That's overtly defeating the disclosure process, and so therefore it's illegal. And people go to jail for doing that. When you give through an LLC and you create it, you give it money, the money goes to a super PAC, and then it disappears, this LLC. LLC is a new acronym, sorry. These are for-profit organizations, so they don't have the same kind of transparency requirements even with the IRS that the social welfare groups have, and that's why they're becoming popular. Yeah, that feels like a contribution in the name of another, and it's a gray area of the law. It's something that needs to be fleshed out in the courts. It's not clear where the boundaries are between actively trying to avoid required disclosure and just participating in the process that doesn't require it. To me, that's the biggest area that we need to clean up, make more straightforward.
Well, and to add that the example Bob used, I believe, is the example that the Fair Political Practices Commission in California got involved, and there were substantial fines. So in some cases, state law has been important here, and state regulators in tracking some of this and then making or holding people accountable when they're trying to launder money.
Yeah, let me point something out here. We're all friends. We've all written work together. We've all reviewed each other's work. And sometimes we tend to look at things the same way. And once in a while, we get blasted from a totally different perspective. And let me give you an example of being blasted. I was giving a talk to a group of people from other countries, developing democracies, about campaign finance. And a gentleman stood up and he said, you know, all your emphasis on disclosure and transparency and citizenship, that would be the end of our democracy. Because if they disclosed who was donating to the out party, that person would get killed. And in terms of helping a nascent political party that wants to offer a different perspective and a different view on politics, they can't get off the ground without money that we can't get off the ground without money that we get from our relatives who live in the United States, and many of whom have become United States citizens. And then he went on to say, and besides, transparency and money isn't the only thing. In our country, if you vote, they put ink on your finger, and if the wrong people see that you voted, they think you support the political system, and they cut that finger off, or sometimes more. So the way we look at transparency and disclosure is sometimes very different than happens in developing democracies and other places.
Okay. If Jeb Bush does not become the Republican nominee, what does that tell us about the role of the new money in politics, given how much he received in your charts?
Money can't buy you love.
I'll second that.
As Robin said in her presentation, there are good examples in history where the more you spend, the worse you do.
Yes.
And usually it's their own money. Clady Williams, who was the governor of Texas, and when he ran for re-election, he had more money than anybody in the room, and he would just spend it and spend it and spend it. And the more people saw him on television, the more disgusted they were. And it can happen usually in those circumstances. But we often say, we use these kind of formula or formal kinds of descriptions for this. It's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. You have to have enough. Nobody can tell you what enough is in precise terms, but you got to have enough to have your message heard. People can make judgments about you. They can include other things in their calculation, but at least they know where you're coming from and that you're out there as a candidate. But beyond that, the increments of more and more and more and more don't necessarily translate into more votes.
You know what, the example, it just kind of put it together now with Bush in particular, can speak to the fact that often the candidate who spends the most is the one who needs to spend themselves out of trouble. So in my home state of Pennsylvania, when Rick Santorum got defeated, remember, don't blame us. He lost his last Senate election, his re-election in Pennsylvania by 17 points and outspent now Senator Casey by more than double. And the problem was, if you've got negatives to deal with, you've got to spend a lot of money explaining that. So Jeb Bush may need that money because of his brother and father, especially his brother, to just get him to a neutral point that might be commensurate with others.
I would add that I think the Trump candidacy means the rule book or the normal expectations for a presidential campaign have to be reconsidered. The amount of media attention that he generates without cost is substantial, and I think more than any other of the presidential candidates, he threw Bush off stride in a variety of ways. We watched some of them live with split screens. And so, it's going to be more than just evaluating the money. It's a multivariate equation, and I think in some ways the Trump candidacy might be taken as a reason to believe the money wouldn't have mattered anyway. If Trump weren't part of it and he had it going through the full cycle, it may well have been a very helpful tool to him. So I think there was more going on, and I think the Trump element needs to be factored in.
Yeah, I would add, Trump is a happy warrior. He's having a great time out there. He's getting a lot of attention, and he's able to do things that establishment candidates can't do because he doesn't have a record that can be pointed to, and he doesn't have the norms of being cautious. Jeb Bush does not come across as a happy warrior. I can in some ways liken Trump to Ross Perot. Started out as a happy warrior. In some ways, I can liken Jeb Bush to his father, George H.W. Bush, looking at his watch. When is this debate going to be over? It just doesn't seem to be really enjoying campaigning and getting in touch with the good people of the United States or the good people of Iowa as much as some of the others.
All right, I'll pose one more question, given that we have about 5 minutes left, and I'll try and encapsulate a few of the additional questions I've had here. Thank you so much for all the good questions. There's a short version of this question, there's a long version of this question. The short version is, what do we do? What's the way forward? The longer version is, do we have to amend the Constitution to declare that corporations are not citizens? Do we have to go to, say, Lessig's idea of campaign finance and freedom dollars? Or on the other side, do we just lift individual contributions, which the Supreme Court may do at some point? And if we're going to do these things, who do we think should be in charge of deciding what the new system should look like? Is it the courts? Is it the people involved in the campaign contributions? Is it the members of Congress? Perhaps each of you could bite off a chunk of that question.
Don't everybody jump in.
Well, I'll start. I think you have to change the court or change the Constitution. And I don't know that either is a very, I know that neither is an easy process, nor a quick one. And the more challenging question, I think, is who should do it. And the Constitution, again, means we have to work through the existing institutions. And there's reasons to believe some of those institutions have a self-interest perspective in this whole sphere, which is where we've been with FECA and BICRA and so forth. So it can end up being a pretty discouraging picture. That being said, I personally believe that BICRA was an important step forward, and I think the decisions that have been made since BICRA have substantially undermined it and made it substantially worse. So I think we can make the system marginally better, either with a constitutional amendment or with a change in the perspective on the court.
I'd go for the Constitution too, but in different areas. I'm not so concerned about free speech issues or equality issues. The thing that I learned, I spent a year abroad in England and talked to a lot of Europeans, and this is in 2008. The thing that they found most difficult to understand about our system was fixed election times. Now, the reason that so many of these other places that do have, they have their own campaign finance scandals, but they spend considerably less, is that you only know when the election's going to be 6 weeks before. We've created, several people have talked about this, an institution. Pull out your Google Calendar and you can know the next 100 elections because it's going to be the first Tuesday after the first Monday, to the point where, I guess this is starting in the 90s, the party campaign committees, when an election would happen, right, this would be around Thanksgiving, they'd bring all the freshman members to Washington for their orientation, and on day one, it's like, this is how you set up your campaign for the next election. And here's the first fundraiser that you need to do to get ready for what's to come. Well, if you only get 6 weeks' notice, you can do a little bit of the fundraising, but you can't be doing what we do, which is investing so much in the television and the polling and all that at certain moments in time when we know it matters and it doesn't. So what the Europeans, by the way, found so strange about us is that if you recall, George W. Bush's approval ratings in 2006 and 2007 were lingering around 25%, sometimes even lower. And they said, why is it that you just don't have a vote of no confidence and get rid of this guy? Why do you have to spend 2 more years when 75% of Americans don't want him? And the answer is, in our system, it was still his turn. And that's how, we do it, right? We have, the terms are very clear. It's very difficult to do that. But in many systems, Italy, the average life of the government for a while was 10 months. When they have a serious policy disagreement, they say, let's go to the voters. Greece has been doing that a lot lately.
There's another way to look at this, I think. Maybe doesn't require any of those. Hopefully doesn't require. And that's to say that maybe the technology takes care of this for us. What you're really talking about is how do we devalue the money? How do we make it that we have a system where I don't care if you give somebody $5 million because it's not going to have that kind of impact that we assume $5 million might have. So maybe it is the fact that you guys only pay attention to social media and don't watch television in real time. Or the fact that the Obama campaign and others since then have shown us that $20 a pop can turn into real money. That hundreds of millions of dollars can be raised from normal Americans in very modest sums over a period of time, and that you can overwhelm those $5 million checks with other kinds of resources. That's really what I mean by devaluing the money. Right. So maybe our politics and the way we conduct our politics will change with new technologies that help to do that.
I would say, what do we do? Well, I'm definitely not a fan of the courts deciding. I think in some ways they're so smart they could say things that the rest of us don't understand or don't believe, such as speech and TV ads and money are the same, and corporations, which never die, are like people. Amending the Constitution is really hard to do, harder than passing a law. I agree, we probably all would agree that competition is good in election, and it's good to have some kind of system where challengers have resources to compete. And technology does help them raise money, and it does help them reach out, and it does in a less expensive way. Whose views should we reflect? The donors, the public, the candidates? Maybe a couple decades ago, actually, I worked with several people. Bob helped with this. We did a survey of people who give money. I followed up later on with a survey of everyone who ran for office, and then a survey of those who won and served in Congress. And wouldn't you know it, everybody was highly critical of the campaign finance system. The candidates, the members of Congress, the significant donors, the public all overwhelmingly didn't like what we had. They just disagreed on where we ought to go. So every nation has sort of a dialogue, kind of a caricature. Canada, breaking up is hard to do. We hear that because the Quebecois constantly looking to leave. A lot of third world countries, you turn against me and I will kill you. In the United States, it's the best government money can buy. It's money in politics. And I think we'll always have that dialogue because of the nature of our political system and because we are, depending on which economist you talk to, a capitalist or a post-capitalist nation. But I would just remind you that this is part of a bigger system of elections. And elections are about conferring power. And our system may not look so beautiful under the microscope, but think of the alternatives. Murdering the leader, co-optation by elites, as happens in Russia, but also the Vatican. Aristocracy, monarchy. People don't get much of a voice like that, and worst of all, a coup d'etat or revolution where blood spills in the street. So if we make you feel a little discouraged, just remember how great our option for conferring power is, our technique compared to other places. I think it's a pretty good thing, and I think our dialogue about money in politics is very good in that it checks the role of money in politics.
Well, it seems very nice to end on an optimistic, hopeful note.
There you go.
Yeah. Why don't we give a big round of applause to our panelists.